Some moments in life come without warning. They crash into the mundane, upending everything we think we know. For the paramedics of Pine Valley Emergency Services, that moment arrived one crisp autumn morning. It was the kind of moment that would forever challenge their understanding of the wild, of nature's unspoken rules, and of the deep, untamed emotions that exist beyond human comprehension. The wheels of the ambulance hummed steadily against the rugged mountain road, their rhythm of familiar comfort to Sarah, who sat in the passenger seat, rechecking the dispatch details. It was a routine call. An elderly woman, Mrs. Peterson, had fallen in her kitchen and needed assistance getting up. There was no urgency, no sense of impending crisis. It was the kind of situation she and her partner, Mike, had handled countless times before. Mike's hands remained firm on the steering wheel as he navigated the winding path, his eyes scanning the road ahead with the careful precision of someone who had spent years maneuvering these treacherous turns. The dense morning fog clung stubbornly to the ground, swirling in ghostly tendrils as the ambulance's headlights carved a narrow tunnel of visibility through the mist. On either side, towering pine trees loomed, their ancient trunks standing as silent sentinels, watching over the mountains. They had driven these roads 100 times, but this morning, something felt different. The first hint of trouble came as a shadow flickered within their beam of light. It was large, too large to be a deer or a coyote. Instinctively, Mike's foot hovered over the brake pedal, ready to react. Within seconds, a massive form emerged from the fog, stepping directly into their path. A bear, not just any bear, one of the largest black bears either of them had ever seen. Sarah's heartbeat quickened, her hand reaching automatically for the radio. A bear in the road wasn't unheard of, but it was certainly a hazard. Standard protocol dictated that they report the wildlife obstruction and wait for it to move on. Normally, a bear would bolt at the sound of an approaching vehicle, disappearing into the safety of the dense forest. But this one didn't move. It stood its ground. Mike and Sarah exchanged wary glances. The bear was acting strangely. Instead of running, it remained firmly in place, blocking their way entirely. Its enormous body swayed slightly, its head moving in slow, deliberate motions, almost as if it were trying to communicate. "Something's wrong," Mike muttered, his fingers tightening on the steering wheel. The headlights caught the bear's eyes, and what they saw there sent an unexpected shiver through them both. Intelligence, desperation, fear. Bears weren't supposed to look at humans like that. Not with understanding. Not with something that resembled pleading. Then, in a moment that defied every natural instinct, the bear did something truly unthinkable. It raised a paw, not in aggression, not in a territorial display, but in a motion that was unmistakably deliberate, like a human waving someone down for help. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had spent over a decade working as a paramedic in these mountains. She had encountered wildlife before, bears, mountain lions, even a lone wolf once. But never had she seen an animal behave like this. The bear took a slow, measured step forward, approaching the driver's side of the ambulance. Its massive paws made no sudden movements, and its posture remained oddly careful, almost gentle. This was not an attack. This was something else entirely. Mike and Sarah sat frozen, every instinct urging them to react, to drive away, to call for backup, to do anything other than sit there staring at a bear that seemed to be asking them for something. The bear placed one paw on the ambulance's hood, a massive dark imprint smeared against the thin layer of condensation on the windshield. Its breath fogged up the glass, creating an almost surreal image in the dim morning light. And still, its eyes remained locked on theirs. Sarah felt a deep, inexplicable pull in her chest. Something was very wrong. But the most shocking moment was yet to come. The bear stepped back, turned toward the forest, then looked over its shoulder. Waiting. Mike gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. Is it telling us to follow?" The bear took another step into the tree line, then paused again, glancing back. There was no doubt about it. It wanted them to go with it. Every safety guideline, every wildlife training they had ever received screamed against following a wild bear into the woods. But this wasn't normal behavior. This wasn't a bear acting like a bear. This was a being in distress, a being who, against all logic, believed that these two humans could help. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. A million thoughts raced through her mind. Should they call it in? Should they wait for animal control? Should they just leave? But something deep in her gut told her that they didn't have time to hesitate. Something terrible had already happened. And if they didn't follow, something even worse might be waiting just beyond the fog. She turned to Mike. "We have to go." His jaw tightened, but after a moment, he gave a sharp nod. Grabbing their emergency kits, they stepped out of the ambulance and into the unknown. The moment Sarah and Mike stepped out of the ambulance, the world seemed to shift around them. The crisp autumn air pressed in, thick with an eerie silence. The usual sounds of the forest, chirping birds, rustling leaves, the distant calls of wildlife, had vanished, leaving only the rhythmic crunch of their boots on the damp earth. The bear stood a few feet ahead, its massive body silhouetted against the shifting fog. It watched them closely, eyes filled with something neither paramedic had ever seen in a wild animal before: trust. Then, without hesitation, it turned and walked into the forest. Sarah and Mike exchanged one last glance before following. Every step felt like a leap into the unknown. The bear's movements were deliberate but urgent. It stayed just ahead, its dark form weaving effortlessly through the dense foliage. Every few paces it would stop, glancing back to ensure they were still behind. It was guiding them, leading them. But to what? Sarah clutched her medical bag tightly, her fingers trembling slightly around the worn leather straps. Her mind raced with possibilities. Had the bear been injured? Was there a cub in trouble? Whatever it was, she knew one thing for certain. This was not normal. This was something beyond anything they had ever encountered. The deeper they ventured, the denser the fog became. Shafts of pale morning light pierced through the canopy in fractured beams, illuminating the gnarled roots and thick underbrush that covered the forest floor. The towering pines loomed above like silent giants, their branches stretching into the mist, giving the entire scene an almost otherworldly feel. Mike's breathing was steady but controlled, his paramedic instincts keeping him alert. He was trained to handle emergencies, to remain calm under pressure. But this was different. His fingers hovered over his radio. He should call this in, but something stopped him. The bear's behavior was unlike anything they had ever been trained for. If they reported this, would anyone even believe them? And besides, something in his gut told him they didn't have time to wait. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as they followed their silent guide deeper into the trees. The air around them grew heavier, thick with an underlying scent that sent a prickle of unease down Sarah's spine. Then suddenly the bear stopped. Its entire body went rigid. A low, mournful sound rumbled deep in its chest, a sound so filled with sorrow that it sent a shiver down both their spines. Sarah and Mike halted, their eyes scanning the dense foliage ahead. The mist shifted, curling around the trees like a living thing. The bear took a few slow steps forward, then turned its massive head toward them. And that was when they saw it, the clearing, a small hidden grove surrounded by towering pines. And in its center, a nightmare. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. There, lying in the damp earth beneath a fallen tree, were 3 bear cubs. 2 of them were motionless, their tiny bodies unnaturally still. The third, barely breathing. Sarah dropped to her knees, her training kicking in. Her hands moved automatically, assessing the tiny cub's condition. It was weak, too weak. Its breathing was shallow, irregular. Blood matted its fur. And then she saw it, the cause. Scattered around the cubs were the remnants of human trash. Torn food wrappers, crushed aluminum cans, and a broken antifreeze bottle. Sarah's stomach turned. She had seen this before. Animals drawn to the sweet scent of antifreeze, unknowingly consuming the deadly poison. It was a slow, excruciating way to die. She looked up at the mother bear, her heart breaking at the raw grief in those dark, intelligent eyes. This was why she had come to them. This was why she had risked everything to break the laws of nature and seek help from humans. Because she had already lost 2 of her babies. and she was not willing to lose the last. Mike was already digging through their emergency kit. "We don't have the right supplies," he muttered. "This isn't a human patient. The dosages, we have to try." Sarah cut in, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her chest. The cub let out a weak, pitiful whimper. It didn't have much time. Sarah's mind raced through possible treatments. They needed to flush the poison from its system, stabilize its vitals, stop the internal bleeding. But how do you treat a dying bear cub in the middle of a forest with only human medical supplies? Mike grabbed the radio. "This is Paramedic Team 312. We need emergency assistance. Wildlife Services, a vet, anyone available. We have a critically injured animal." Static. No signal. They were too deep in the forest. They were on their own. The mother bear let out a low, guttural sound, her massive body shifting anxiously as she watched them work. She trusted them. But if they failed... Sarah swallowed hard. They wouldn't fail. Not this time. She took a deep breath and reached for the IV kit. They had one chance to save this cub, and they had to do it now. Sarah's hands moved quickly, her paramedic training taking over as she prepared to do something she had never imagined, treating a wild animal with human medical supplies. The cub was fading fast. Its tiny body trembled with shallow, uneven breaths. Its gums were pale, almost white, a clear sign of severe blood loss. The jagged wounds on its paws and mouth, likely caused by the sharp metal edges of a torn can, were still seeping. But the worst of it wasn't the cuts. It was the poison. Antifreeze poisoning was lethal, shutting down the organs one by one. In humans, they had a chance if treated quickly. But for a bear cub? Sarah pushed the thought away. They had to try. Mike ripped open their emergency kit, pulling out gauze and antiseptic. "We can stop the bleeding," he said, already moving to clean the cub's wounds. "But the poison, we don't have the right treatment for this." Sarah bit her lip. Normally, a poisoning patient would need fluids to flush the toxins and an antidote to neutralize the effects. But they had no antidote, and they had no time. She thought fast. "We can dilute it," Mike frowned. "How?" Sarah grabbed the IV bag and a sterile syringe. "If we can push fluids fast enough, we might be able to slow the damage until we get help." She had never placed an IV in a bear before. The anatomy was similar enough to a dog, but it was still a wild animal, a terrified, suffering wild animal, and its mother was watching. The mother bear made a low, anxious noise as Sarah gently touched the cub's leg, searching for a vein. Sarah forced her hands to stay steady. She had worked under pressure before. She had treated car crash victims, heart attack patients, even people injured in wild animal attacks. But this was different. She wasn't just treating an animal. She was treating a mother's child. And the mother bear, one of the most powerful creatures in the wild, was placing all of her trust in Sarah's hands. She found the vein, took a deep breath, inserted the needle. The cub twitched slightly, a faint whimper escaping its weak body. Sarah held her breath. The mother bear let out a low growl, deep, warning, protective. Mike tensed beside her. For a second, Sarah thought the bear would lunge. But then, nothing. The mother bear just watched. And then, to their astonishment, she did something no wild animal should ever do. She stepped back, as if she understood, as if she knew they were trying to help. Sarah swallowed hard and focused. "We need to keep the fluids going," she murmured to Mike. "We need to buy time." Mike nodded, quickly setting up the IV drip. The saline would help dilute the poison in the cub's system, slowing its effects. It wasn't a cure, but it was the best they could do. The minutes dragged by. Sarah and Mike worked with careful precision, cleaning the cub's wounds, monitoring its pulse, adjusting the fluids as needed. The mother bear remained close but never interfered. She paced, sniffed at her cub, let out soft, mournful sounds, but she never stopped them. Sarah risked a glance at her. Her massive body was tense, her eyes locked on them. But there was something else there too, something that looked like hope. Sarah turned back to the cub. Its breathing had steadied slightly. Its tiny body still trembled, but the desperate, erratic gasps had become more regular. It was working, but they weren't safe yet. They needed real help. Mike grabbed the radio again, stepping a few paces away to try and find a signal. Sarah stayed with the cub, adjusting the flow of the IV, keeping watch on its vitals. Then, a rustling in the trees. A sound too big to be a bird or a small animal. Sarah's pulse spiked. She turned her head slowly. Something was coming. Mike froze, his radio still in hand. The mother bear's ears perked up. The forest had gone silent. Sarah's grip tightened on the IV bag. Then, a shadow moved in the trees. Something else was here, and it wasn't alone. The air in the clearing thickened with an almost tangible tension. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the rustling in the trees grew louder. Twigs snapped, leaves trembled. Something big was moving through the underbrush, and it was getting closer. Mike stood rigid, his fingers still wrapped around the radio, but he had stopped trying to call for help. He too had heard the sound. Sarah's instinct screamed at her to move, to grab the cub and run, but there was nowhere to go. They were deep in the forest, surrounded by dense trees and thick fog. Their only protection was the mother bear, standing between them and whatever was coming. The bear's body tensed, her ears flattened against her massive head, and a low, rumbling growl built in her chest. It wasn't the sound of a frightened animal. It was the sound of a mother preparing for battle. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. What else could be out here? Then, the first figure emerged from the trees. A second later, another, then a third. 3 men stepped into the clearing. Hunters. They weren't wearing the orange safety gear of legal hunters. They weren't carrying rifles slung respectfully over their shoulders like responsible sportsmen. They had shotguns. One of them carried a crossbow. The moment they spotted Sarah, Mike, and the bears, they froze. Their eyes darted from the mother bear to the paramedics, confusion flashing across their faces. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. This was bad. The mother bear's growl deepened, her lips curling back to reveal sharp teeth. The man with the crossbow, tall, heavy-set, dressed in dark camouflage, narrowed his eyes. "What the hell is this?" he muttered. One of the others, a wiry man with a scar running down his jaw, lifted his shotgun slightly. Not enough to aim, yet, but enough to show that he wasn't here to make friends. "You lost or something?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. Sarah forced herself to stay calm. "We're paramedics," she said evenly. "We were called for an emergency." The heavy-set man's gaze flicked to the cub, lying on the ground, the IV line still feeding into its tiny leg. His face twisted in something between amusement and disbelief. "You're treating a bear." Mike's voice was firm. "It's injured, poisoned." The third man, shorter than the others but stocky and broad, shifted uncomfortably. "Damn shame," he muttered. "Lot of animals getting sick from human trash these days." Sarah caught the flicker of guilt in his expression, but the man with the crossbow wasn't feeling guilty. He took a slow step forward. "Well," he said, voice low, "maybe it's for the best. Ain't no point saving something that's just gonna grow up to be a problem." Sarah felt a cold chill race down her spine. Mike stepped between her and the men, his stance rigid. "We're not letting you harm this animal." The scarred man gave a dry chuckle. "And what are you gonna do about it?" The mother bear let out a deep, bone-rattling growl. For a split second, the men hesitated. They weren't afraid of Sarah and Mike, but they were afraid of her. The heavy-set man licked his lips, glancing at his partners. "Look, we don't want trouble." He nodded toward the cub. "But you can't seriously think that thing is going to survive." Sarah's jaw tightened. "That's not for you to decide?" The shorter man shifted again. He was the only one who seemed truly uncomfortable with the situation. He looked at the cub, then at the mother bear, then back at Sarah. "If it makes it, will you take it to a rehab center?" Sarah hesitated. "If we can get it stable, yes." The heavy-set man shook his head. "Waste of damn time." The mother bear took a step forward, her enormous form blocking their view of the cub. Her eyes locked onto the men, and for a moment, something silent passed between them. A warning, a promise. The scarred man shifted his grip on the shotgun. Sarah's pulse spiked. Then, the stocky man spoke. "We should go." His voice wasn't uncertain. It was firm, final. The heavy-set man sighed. Yeah, come on." The scarred man lingered a second longer, staring at Sarah with something unreadable in his expression. Then finally he muttered something under his breath and turned away. Within seconds, the three of them had disappeared back into the trees. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah let out a slow breath. Mike shook his head. That could have gone bad. Sarah nodded. Yeah, really bad. They turned their attention back to the cub. Its breathing had steadied, but they still had to get it out of here. And now they weren't just racing against time. They were racing against the dangers that lurked within the forest, both natural and human. The tension in the clearing slowly faded, but the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air. Sarah let out a shaky breath, her hands still trembling slightly as she turned back to the cub. Its tiny chest was rising and falling in a more stable rhythm now, but it was far from safe. The IV was helping, but without proper treatment, it was only a temporary fix. They needed to get this cub to real medical care. Mike rubbed a hand over his face, exhaling hard. We can't stay here. Those guys could come back. Sarah nodded. Agreed. But how do we move it? They both turned their heads toward the mother bear. She was watching them closely, her massive form tense, her dark eyes unreadable. She had chased down an ambulance, stood her ground against humans, led them deep into the forest, all for this moment. Would she let them take her cub? Sarah crouched low, speaking in the softest voice she could manage. We need to help your baby. The mother bear didn't move. Sarah reached out and gently adjusted the IV line. The cub let out a faint whimper, and instantly, the mother bear was at its side, nuzzling it gently with her snout. The depth of her love was unmistakable. Mike swallowed hard. We can't carry it out with her watching like this. If she thinks we're taking it from her... Sarah understood what he was saying. A mother bear, no matter how much she seemed to trust them, was still a wild animal. If she thought they were stealing her baby, her instincts could override whatever fragile bond they had formed. Sarah thought quickly. She had treated parents before, desperate mothers clutching their children in emergency rooms, fathers refusing to leave their kids' sides even when doctors needed space to work. The emotions weren't so different here. The love was the same. Sarah met the mother bear's gaze. Come with us. Mike stiffened beside her. But Sarah knew deep in her bones that this was the only way. The bear let out a soft rumbling sound, her ears twitching. She didn't charge. She didn't run. She just stood there, waiting. Sarah took a slow breath. We're going to lift your baby now, she said. Her voice was calm, steady. Please, trust us. She and Mike worked together, carefully wrapping the cub in a thermal blanket to keep it warm. It barely stirred, its tiny body exhausted from the trauma. Every move they made, the mother bear watched. Every breath they took, she monitored. Mike slowly lifted the cub into his arms. Easy, easy. The mother bear's muscles tensed. Sarah's heart pounded. Then, the bear took a single step forward, not in aggression, not in fear, but in understanding. She wasn't stopping them. She was following them. Sarah felt a lump rise in her throat. This mother bear was willing to go wherever they went, as long as it meant saving her child. Mike adjusted his grip on the cub, then nodded toward Sarah. Let's move. Carefully, they began their journey back through the dense forest. The mother bear stayed just behind them, her every step measured, controlled. She never strayed too far from her baby. She never let them out of her sight. Sarah had never seen anything like it. They were walking through the wilderness, carrying an injured bear cub, while its mother, an animal who should have been attacking them, should have been terrified, moved with them side by side, trusting them, believing in them. Mike kept glancing back. I can't believe this is happening. Sarah couldn't either. They pressed forward, their boots crunching against fallen leaves, the morning fog thinning as the first true rays of sunlight pierced through the trees. The weight of the night was lifting, and with it came a fragile, desperate hope. If they could just make it back to the ambulance. If they could just get help in time. The cub had a chance. Sarah's pulse quickened as they reached the edge of the clearing. She could see the road ahead. The ambulance was still there, waiting. They were almost safe. Then, a sound shattered the silence. A noise that made Sarah's stomach drop. A gunshot. The gunshot ripped through the morning air, its echo bouncing off the trees like a crack of thunder. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Mike froze mid-step, his grip tightening around the bear cub. The mother bear's reaction was immediate. Her ears flattened, her body lowered, and a deep guttural growl rumbled from her chest. Something was very wrong. Sarah whipped her head toward the source of the sound. Movement in the trees. Then, another gunshot. This time the bullet struck a tree just a few feet away, splintering bark and sending debris flying. Mike cursed under his breath. They came back. Sarah's pulse pounded in her ears. The hunters. The men they had encountered in the clearing. They had waited until they were almost safe, and now they were trying to finish what they had started. The mother bear let out a ferocious roar. It was no longer a sound of warning. It was a declaration of war. More movement in the trees. Then, voices. "I told you, they're taking the cub." "Damn fools, that thing's not going to survive anyway." Mike gritted his teeth. "We have to move, now." Sarah didn't hesitate. She reached for her radio, trying desperately to get a signal. Static. They were still too deep in the forest. They were on their own. Another shot rang out. This one was closer. Sarah grabbed Mike's arm. "We run!" Without another word, they took off toward the ambulance. The mother bear followed, her massive paws pounding against the earth, her body tense with fury and fear. She wasn't just running with them, she was running for them, for her cub, for their survival. The forest blurred around them, the trees whipped past in a streak of green and brown. The ambulance, so close now, shimmered in the early morning light like a beacon of salvation. Another gunshot. The mother bear let out a snarl. Sarah didn't stop to see where the bullet had hit. She couldn't. They had to make it. Then, the final stretch of road. The ambulance was just a few yards ahead. Mike reached it first, yanking open the back doors and carefully setting the cub inside. "Get in!" Sarah hesitated. She turned back, her eyes locking onto the mother bear. For the first time, she saw something in the great beast's gaze that terrified her. Not anger, not rage, acceptance. The mother bear knew. She knew she couldn't come with them. She knew the humans would take care of her last surviving baby. And she knew, if she stayed, if she fought, her cub would be safe. Sarah's chest ached. The bear had chased them down, placed her trust in them, broken every law of nature, all for love. Now she was making her final sacrifice. Sarah shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "No, come with us. You have to come with us." The mother bear only let out a low rumbling sound, a sound that somehow carried a message. "Go!" Then she turned and charged, straight into the trees, straight toward the hunters. Sarah wanted to scream. Mike grabbed her arm. "Sarah, we have to go." Another gunshot. Sarah felt her whole body shake. But she knew. She knew what the mother bear was doing. She was buying them time. She was protecting them the only way she knew how. Sarah clenched her jaw, stepping into the ambulance. Mike slammed the doors shut. He jumped into the driver's seat, throwing the vehicle into gear. The tires screeched against the pavement as they sped down the road. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for the radio. "Please, please work this time." She pressed the button. "This is Paramedic Team 312. We have a critically injured bear cub, possible antifreeze poisoning. We need emergency veterinary assistance. And," she hesitated, her voice cracking, "and we have an active situation in Pine Valley Forest. Armed hunters, a mother bear protecting her cub. We need backup, now." For a second, nothing but static. Then, "Copy that. Team 312, emergency responders en route. Hold your position until further assistance arrives." Sarah let out a breath. They had made it. The cub had a chance. But as they sped away from the forest, her heart remained back there. With the mother bear. With the creature who had trusted them. Who had loved her baby enough to risk everything. Who had saved them, even when she was the one in need. Sarah pressed a hand to her chest, trying to steady her breathing. "Do you think she'll make it?" Mike asked quietly. Sarah didn't answer right away. She stared out the window, watching as the fog slowly lifted over the trees. And then in the distance, a shape, dark, large, standing at the edge of the forest. Sarah's breath hitched. The mother bear. alive, watching them leave. Sarah's lips parted, a quiet gasp escaping her throat. She lifted a hand, just slightly, and the bear did the same, a final goodbye. Then, the bear turned and disappeared into the trees, leaving behind the only thing that mattered, her child, safe, alive, and with hope for a future. The story of the mother bear and her cub spread quickly. Wildlife rescue teams found the site where the tragedy had taken place, the campsite, the poisoned food, the scattered metal cans that had led to the deaths of two cubs and nearly a third. The hunters were caught, arrested for illegal poaching, their weapons confiscated. As for the surviving cub, it was taken to a wildlife rehabilitation center where veterinarians worked around the clock to nurse it back to health. And when it was finally strong enough, it was released, back into the wild, back into her territory. And though no one ever saw the mother bear again, Sarah and Mike knew she was out there, watching, protecting, waiting for the day when her baby would return home. The lesson that remained, Sarah never forgot that morning. The morning when a bear, an animal humans feared, had placed her trust in them. The morning when she had witnessed something deeper than instinct, something that proved love was not limited to humankind. Love was wild, love was instinctive. Love, true love, was powerful enough to break every rule of nature. And sometimes, the wildest creatures know exactly when to ask for help.